Before we begin, if this story moves you, please subscribe to the channel and follow along to the end. Leave a comment below with your city. Want to know how far this story travels. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a man who has been alone long enough. It is not the quiet of peace. It is not the quiet of contentment. It is the quiet of a house where the clocks still run, but no one winds them anymore, functional, persistent, and completely without warmth. Calhoun Briggs had lived inside that quiet for 3 years. He was 45 years old in the spring of 1926, and he had the kind of face that the Wyoming wind builds over decades. Not ugly, not handsome in any way that would make a stranger look twice, but deeply legible. The way old fence posts are legible, the way stone walls are legible, built to last and shaped by everything they had endured. His hands were the hands of a man who had never once in his adult life gone to bed with work left undone. His shoulders carried the particular set of someone who had learned early that no one was coming to help. The ranch had been his father's first. Josiah Briggs had bought the land in 1905 with money he had saved for 11 years working cattle drives from Texas to Montana, and he had built the house himself with lumber. He hauled 40 miles on a wagon that broke down twice on the journey. Cal had grown up on that land. He had learned to ride on it, learned to track on it, learned the particular language of sky and soil that told a man when the weather was turning before the clouds gave any sign. When Josiah died in 1919, he left the ranch to both his sons equally. The older son, Cal, stayed. The younger son, Emmett, tried. That was the most honest thing Cal had ever thought about his brother, and he had thought it many times in the years since Emmett's death. Emmett had tried. He was not a dishonest man. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had been born with a restlessness in his chest that he never found the right name for, and he had spent his whole life mistaking that restlessness for ambition, for wanderlust, for anything other than what it actually was. Fear of being ordinary, fear of being rooted, fear that if he stayed in one place long enough, the place would reveal that he was less than he had always imagined himself to be. Emmett had married a woman named Catherine in 1912. They had a son named Shepard in 1913. By 1915, Catherine had taken the boy to her mother's house in Cheyenne and not come back, and Emmett had not asked her to. After that, Emmett drifted. He came back to the ranch in seasons of winter. Here, a planting here, and each time he was good company and good help, and genuinely glad to see his brother. And each time he left again, when the season changed, as if he were a man who could only exist in transition, never in arrival. In 1921, when Cal had been laid low for 6 weeks with a fever that had the doctor making 2 trips out from Laramie, Emmett had come back and managed the ranch. He had made a decision during that time, a financial decision, a loan from the Laramie Cattlemen's Bank, to cover operating costs, and he had signed papers that Cal never fully read, because Cal trusted his brother in the way that men trust the people they have known since childhood, which is to say completely and without examination. Emmett died in January of 1925. A horse, a patch of ice, a ditch. Quick, at least. The doctor said he likely felt nothing. He left behind a 12-year-old son who had grown up mostly in Cheyenne, a handful of debts, 17 letters addressed to his brother that he had never sent, and a restlessness that could no longer do anyone any harm. Cal had driven to Cheyenne and brought Shepard home without being asked because there was no one else to ask, and because the boy was an extension of his brother, and because the one thing Cal understood completely was obligation. He was not certain in those first months whether what he felt for the boy was love. He was certain that he would not abandon him. In his experience, those two things eventually arrived at the same place. Shepard Briggs was 13 years old and suspicious of everything that had not yet proven itself reliable, which was most things. He was not sullen. He was watchful. There is a difference, though adults frequently confuse the two. Sullenness is performance, a signal sent outward asking to be noticed. Watchfulness is strategy information gathered quietly, processed internally, conclusions held close until the evidence warrants sharing them. Shep had lost his father twice, once when he was 2 years old and did not understand it, and once when he was 12 and understood it completely. He had spent the intervening years watching his mother rebuild her life with the careful economy of a woman who could not afford another mistake, and he had learned from her the particular discipline of not wanting things too loudly until you were reasonably certain you could keep them. He missed his father in the way you miss a person you never fully had, with a grief that had no clean edges, that shaded into anger at the borders that sometimes in the dark felt less like mourning and more like a complaint about the general injustice of how people were made. He liked his uncle. He would not have said this out loud yet, but he had been watching Cal Briggs for a year and had not yet found evidence of the things he was watching for cruelty, indifference, the particular carelessness of a man who was present in body but nowhere else. Instead, he had found a man who did what he said he would do, who explained things without condescension, who admitted when he was wrong about the weather or the condition of offense without making a performance of it. Shep was not ready to call this love either. He would have called it data, promising data. When Cal told him in February of 1926 that he had placed an advertisement in a newspaper that a woman might be coming to the ranch that she might stay, Shep had processed this information with the same watchful quiet he applied to everything. He had asked one question. Does she know what she's coming to? Cal had looked at him for a moment before answering. I told her the truth in the letters. What she does with that is her choice. Shep had nodded. This was acceptable. People who told the truth in letters were somewhat more likely to tell the truth in person. He would reserve judgment. Eleanor Voss read Calhoun Briggs's third letter for the 7th time on the train from Denver to Laramie. This was not sentiment. She was not a sentimental woman, or rather she had trained herself out of sentiment the way you train yourself out of a bad habit with repetition and consequence until the instinct is still there, but buried deep enough that it rarely causes problems. 9 years of marriage to Theodore Voss had been very effective training. She read the letter because it troubled her in a way she could not yet categorize. Theodore had written her beautiful letters when they were courting. She still remembered the quality of them, the precise vocabulary, the careful structure, the way each sentence seemed to have been composed with the awareness that it might be saved and reread. She had saved them. She had reread them. She had believed them completely. They were not lies exactly. Theodore had believed what he wrote at the time he wrote it. He had believed in his version of her, the version he could accommodate, the version that fit inside the life he had already designed. His letters had described his intentions for her more than they described her, and she had been 20 years old and too inexperienced to know the difference. Calhoun Briggs's letters were not beautiful. The vocabulary was plain. The sentences were short. There was no architecture to them, no sense of a man composing for posterity. The third letter, which she was reading for the 7th time, said this: I want to be straightforward with you before you make a decision that can't easily be unmade. The ranch is working land. The house is clean, but it is not comfortable in the way you may be accustomed to. The winters here are not mild. My nephew Shepard is 13 and has had a difficult few years and is not easy with strangers, though I believe he is essentially a good boy. I cannot promise you happiness because I don't think that is an honest thing to promise. I can promise that I will not deceive you about what this life is and that I will not ask you to be less than you are. If those things matter to you, perhaps write back. She had written back. She had written back because in 9 years of marriage, she had not once been told, I will not ask you to be less than you are, and she had not fully understood until she read those words in a plain letter from a stranger in Wyoming how much of her life had been spent making herself smaller. Theodore had not been a violent man. This was important, and she was careful to be precise about it because imprecision in either direction did damage to women who had suffered more than she had and to the truth. Theodore had been a man of requirements. He required order. He required correctness. He required that the house run without friction, that his wife move through social situations without error, that the version of Eleanor Voss presented to the world be consistently immaculate. He had not beaten her for failures. He had simply withdrawn, gone cold, in a way that was perfectly calibrated to produce the maximum anxiety in a woman who had been taught that a man's approval was the primary measure of her worth. She had spent 9 years learning to live inside his requirements. She had become genuinely skilled at it. This was the thing she was most ashamed of. Not that she had been managed, but that she had managed herself so thoroughly that by the end she could no longer always tell the difference between what she actually wanted and what she had concluded she should want. Theodore died in the autumn of 1917, a heart, a staircase, a Tuesday morning. She had been 30 years old. She had not cried at the funeral. This had alarmed her more than anything in the preceding 9 years. She had stood at his grave in her black dress on a gray November morning and waited for grief, and what had come instead was something she could not name at the time and could still only approximate now, a vast, terrifying openness. As if a wall she had leaned against for 9 years had simply ceased to exist, and she had to learn at 30 years old how to stand without it. She had spent the following 9 years learning. She had managed the Voss estate competently. Theodore had not expected her to understand finance, which meant he had never arranged for her not to understand it, which meant she had quietly learned it on her own during the years when he believed she was occupied with acceptable female pursuits. She had discovered in his absence that she had opinions about most things and that her opinions were frequently correct. She had discovered that she was capable of making decisions under pressure without dissolving. She had discovered, slowly and with considerable surprise, that she was more than the shape Theodore had made of her. What she had not discovered was what to do with all of it. She was 38 years old. She was competent and self-sufficient and completely directionless in the way that people sometimes are when they have spent so long reacting to circumstances that they have never developed the habit of choosing. She did not want another Theodore. She did not want to be managed. She was not certain she wanted to be married at all, except that she was also tired of the particular loneliness of a life lived entirely within her own counsel, and she was honest enough with herself to know it. The advertisement had been plain. Widower 45 working ranch outside Laramie, Wyoming, seeks capable woman of good character for companionship and partnership. Not a romantic proposition. An honest one. She had almost not written. Then she had written. Then she had almost not sent it. Then she had sent it. 3 letters later, she was on a train to Wyoming, watching the land go flat, and then flatter, and then open into something so wide it made her chest feel strange, as if her lungs were accustomed to a smaller sky. Cal was 15 minutes late. She was standing on the platform with her 2 cases when the wagon came down the road at a pace that suggested the driver was not urgently concerned about her comfort. She watched him pull up, took him in the way she had learned to take people in quickly and without appearing to do it. Tall, broad through the shoulders, face like something that had been left out in the weather for a long time and was better for it. He was looking at the platform with an expression she could not read yet, which was unusual. She could read most people's expressions before they opened their mouths. He climbed down from the wagon and walked toward her without hurrying. Mrs. Voss? Not a question, not a greeting exactly, an acknowledgement. Mr. Briggs? She matched his register. The horse? Something shifted in his expression, surprise she thought, and then something that might have been recalibration. Baymare caught a shoe on a root, had to check the hoof before I left. Is she all right? She'll be fine. Then I didn't wait for nothing, Ellie said. I waited 15 minutes for a mare that's going to be fine. That's an acceptable reason. He looked at her for a moment. She had the impression he was deciding something. I'm sorry for the wait, he said, not for the horse. I understood that. He reached for her cases. She picked up the smaller one before he could take it. They walked to the wagon in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which surprised her. Silences were usually uncomfortable when they involved strangers. This one felt more like a working silence, 2 people occupying the same space without requiring anything from each other immediately. She had forgotten that was possible. The boy was in the wagon bed, 13 as the letters had said, with his uncle's coloring and something in his face that was his own, a quality of attention that she recognized, that particular stillness of the child who has learned that the world does not always announce its important moments in advance. He looked at her. She looked at him. You're from Boston, he said. I am. You don't know how to ride. Not yet. He held her gaze for another second. Then he looked away, which she did not take as dismissal. She took it as the end of a first assessment. She was familiar with those. The ranch was everything the letters had promised and nothing the letters could have conveyed. The house was clean. It was also austere in the way of a space maintained by someone who had no interest in comfort for its own sake. Every object present because it was useful. Nothing present because it was pleasing. The kitchen was functional. The parlor had a single chair and a wooden table and a shelf of books that had been read, she could tell by the spines, many times. There were curtains on the kitchen window. Blue faded to the color of winter sky. She noticed them because they were the only thing in the room that had been chosen rather than acquired. She noticed everything in those first hours with the deliberate thoroughness of a woman who had learned that environments tell you more about people than people tell you about themselves. The firewood was stacked with the alignment of someone for whom disorder was physically uncomfortable. The kitchen knives were sharp. She tested the edge of one lightly while setting the table for supper and found it razor precise. The accounts ledger on the desk in the corner was open to a page of figures in handwriting so careful it was almost mechanical. Calhoun Briggs was a man who controlled what he could control because so much else could not be controlled. She recognized this. She had spent years living inside a similar architecture, though Theodore's version had been decorated with mahogany and good curtains. Supper that first evening was quiet. Cal asked her one question, whether the journey had been long. She said it had been longer from Boston to Denver than from Denver to Laramie, which was true and not really an answer to what he was asking, and he did not press it. Shep ate with the efficiency of a boy who regarded meals as a logistical event rather than a social one. When she was clearing the table, she glanced back at the two of them, uncle and nephew, sitting in the lamplight, not talking, not uncomfortable with the not talking, and felt something she had not expected to feel. Familiar. It felt in some strange and specific way familiar. Not like coming home to a place she had been before, like coming home to a shape of life she had wanted without knowing she was wanting it. She filed this away carefully and did not examine it further. Not yet. She had learned the cost of deciding things before she had enough information. Her first morning on the ranch began at 5 o'clock. She was not asked to rise at 5. She rose because she heard the sounds of work beginning outside her window, and she was constitutionally incapable of lying in bed while other people worked. She dressed in the most practical clothes she owned, which were less practical than she would have preferred, and went to find what needed doing. What needed doing turned out to be everything. She started in the kitchen because the kitchen was familiar territory, built a fire in the stove without having to ask where the matches were, and had coffee ready when Cal came in from the barn 40 minutes later. He stopped in the doorway when he saw the coffee, just for a moment. Then he came in and sat down and poured himself a cup without comment. She would understand later that this was for him a significant response. After breakfast, she asked him to show her the ranch. Not to be shown, she was careful about the distinction, careful about her phrasing, because she had learned that how you asked for things shaped what you received. She said, "I'd like to understand how the work runs. Would you walk me through it?" He walked her through it. He did not condescend. He explained things once and assumed she had understood, and when she asked questions, he answered them directly without the particular wariness of a man who has decided that explaining things to women is an imposition. She had encountered that wariness often enough to notice its absence sharply. In the afternoon, while Cal was mending fence on the north pasture, Shep appeared at her elbow without announcement. "You can come watch if you want," he said. "He won't say so, but he won't say not to either." She went. She watched Cal work the fence line, the economy of motion that came from doing a thing thousands of times the way the work seemed to cost him nothing, though she could see it was physical and demanding. Shep handed him things before he asked for them. This had the quality of long practice. She thought these two have built something together. They don't know they've built it yet, but it's there. She attempted supper on the 5th day. Not the first because she was not foolish enough to treat a new kitchen like a familiar one, and not the 4th because she was still calibrating the stove. The 5th day she felt ready. She was not ready. The corn chowder caught on the bottom of the pot in the last 10 minutes, and the burning gave it a flavor that was, she thought, charitable to call rustic. She served it anyway because she did not believe in hiding her failures. Hiding failures was how you accumulated them. Cal sat down and began eating without comment. This was either kindness or stoicism, and she was not sure which. Shep looked at his bowl. He looked at Ellie. He looked at Cal. "Mrs. Dott's chowder doesn't taste like this," he said. Cal's spoon stopped moving. "Shep, I'm not saying it's bad. I'm saying it's different. The two things you just said mean the same thing." "Not exactly." Ellie set down her own spoon. "He's right," she said. "It's different in a way that means worse." The bottom burned. She picked up her spoon again and ate a full bite with an expression of deliberate equanimity. "I'll do better next time. Who's Mrs. Dott?" There was a pause that was not quite a silence, more like a moment of recalibration between the two of them. "She's a neighbor," Cal said. "Dorothy Langford. Her ranch is about 2 miles east. She cooks well. She cooks everything well, Shep said, apparently deciding that accuracy was more important than tact. She used to bring food over a lot. Used to, another pause. Different quality from the first. She still does sometimes, Cal said. She's a good neighbor. Ellie looked at him and then did not look at him, which was its own kind of looking. There was something in those two words, good neighbor, that carried more history than the words themselves could hold. She had heard enough careful language in her life to recognize it when a man was using words to fill a space where more complicated words would not be safe. She let it go. She had time. Dorothy Langford arrived the following afternoon with a basket covered in a checked cloth, in the unhurried manner of a woman who knew the precise dimensions of her welcome. She was 41. She was not beautiful in any obvious way, but she had the face that became more interesting the longer you looked at it, intelligent, composed with something unresolved, living just behind the composure, the way still water is still on top but moving underneath. She was dressed practically as women on working ranches dress practically, and she moved through Cal's kitchen with the ease of someone who had moved through it many times before. She looked at Ellie with the same directness that Ellie brought to most situations, and Ellie recognized the quality of the look immediately because she had given it herself to people she was trying to assess honestly rather than strategically. "You're Eleanor," Dot said. "Ellie." She extended her hand. Dot shook it. Her grip was firm and brief and matched her manner. Cal appeared in the doorway and seemed to experience the brief, particular discomfort of a man who has not fully anticipated something he probably should have anticipated. Dot gave him a glance that contained Ellie thought an entire conversation conducted in shorthand, and he accepted it with the slight adjustment of a man who had received such glances before and knew there was no useful response to them. "I'll leave you to it," he said, and disappeared back outside with the decisiveness of a man choosing a tactical retreat. Dot watched him go. Then she set her basket on the table and began unpacking it with the methodical calm of a woman who had made a decision before arriving and was simply executing it. "He's useless in a kitchen," Dot said, "and he knows it. That's at least something." "He's thorough everywhere else," Ellie said. "I imagine he trades on that." The corner of Dot's mouth moved slightly. "You got here 6 days ago." "I pay attention." "So do I." She placed a covered dish on the counter and turned to face Ellie fully, and her expression was the expression of a woman who has lived long enough to know that the truth said plainly is usually less painful than the truth discovered sideways. "Then I'll tell you something plainly, and you can do with it what you like. Cal Briggs has been my neighbor for 20 years. He is also the most decent man I have ever known in my life, which is a harder thing to say than it sounds, because I know exactly what it cost me to understand it." Ellie waited. "I have been in love with him for 12 years, Dot said. "He has known about it for approximately 11. He has never pretended otherwise, and he has never done anything about it, and he has never been cruel about either of those facts. Not once in 12 years. She looked at Ellie steadily. "I'm not telling you this to stake a claim. I'm telling you this so you know who you're dealing with. So you don't waste time trying to figure out what the complication is. The complication was me, and it wasn't a complication he ever took advantage of, and that's the end of it." The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" Ellie asked. Not combative, genuinely asking. "Because you're looking around this house trying to understand it. The curtains in the kitchen, I put those there. The pot on the second hook from the left, that's where I always hung it. You've been cataloging." Dot said it without judgment. "You're right, too. I just thought I'd save you some time." Ellie considered this woman. She considered what it would cost a person to do what Dot was doing, to arrive on a Tuesday afternoon with food and honesty and no apparent interest in making it difficult. "Thank you," she said. It was the only honest response. "Don't thank me," Dot said. "Just be good to him and to the boy." She picked up her empty basket. "He's been a long time alone. Longer than the 3 years since he was technically alone. Some men are alone even when they're not." She left without drama, without waiting for a response that might complicate what had been said. The door closed behind her. The kitchen was quiet again. Ellie stood for a moment looking at the blue curtains in the window, faded almost to gray at the edges where the morning light hit them. Then she put the kettle on and went back to work. 2 weeks after Ellie arrived at the Briggs Ranch on a clear evening in late April when the sky above Wyoming was the particular shade of dark blue that exists only between the last of the sunset and the first of the stars, she and Cal sat on the porch after Shep had gone to bed. It was not planned. They both simply did not go inside when the occasion to go inside passed. The evening was cold enough to require a coat and not cold enough to make sitting outside unreasonable, and they sat in the two wooden chairs that faced the open land, and they were quiet together in the way they had both, it seemed, become accustomed to. Cal spoke first. "Do you regret coming?" She thought about it. She had learned watching him that he distinguished between people who thought before answering and people who performed thinking before saying what they had already decided, and she wanted to give him the real version. "I don't regret any of the days," she said. "I'm not sure yet what I'm building toward, but none of the days have been wrong." He nodded, as if this were an acceptable report from the field. "Why did you really place the advertisement?" she asked. "Not the practical reasons. You said those in the letters. The real reason." The evening air moved between them. An owl somewhere in the dark pasture spoke once and went silent. "Shep needs to see," Cal said, "that a person can choose to stay." She waited. His father didn't stay. His mother stopped staying. "I stayed because this land needed staying to, and because I'm made the way I'm made, I don't know how to leave something I'm responsible for. But that's not the same as choosing." He was looking at the land, not at her. "I wanted the boy to see someone choose, to see two people decide to build something and then build it. He's never seen that." Ellie looked at the land too, at the vast dark of it, at the particular silence of a place that had been worked by human hands and still belonged essentially to itself. "What about Emmett?" she said. The question sat between them. She had not intended to ask it tonight. She was not certain she had intended to ask it at all. It had simply come the way questions do when you have been patient long enough that the patience itself creates a kind of pressure. Cal was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. "Emmett was the opposite of me," he said finally. "Same blood, completely opposite. I stayed too long. He couldn't stay long enough." He turned his cup in his hands, the gesture of someone who does not know what to do with their hands when they are saying something true. "I loved him. I was angry at him for most of my adult life, and I loved him. I still don't know entirely how those two things live together." "They live together in most families," Ellie said. "You just don't talk about it." "No." He was quiet again. "He made a decision when I was sick, signed some papers I didn't read well enough afterward. I don't know yet exactly what it cost us. I might be about to find out." She looked at him. "There's a man in Laramie," he said, "Harlan Price. He's been circling this place since winter. He came out last month with an offer. I turned him down." He paused. He didn't seem like a man who took no for an answer. "What kind of man does he seem like?" "The kind who asks questions he already knows the answers to." Ellie said nothing for a moment. She was thinking about Theodore, about a different kind of man who asked questions he already knew the answers to, though Theodore's questions had been social rather than financial weapons deployed in drawing rooms rather than across a desk. "When he comes back," she said, "I'd like to be there." Cal looked at her. It was, she thought, the first time in 2 weeks that he had looked at her with something other than careful neutrality, something more like genuine attention, the kind you bring to a thing that has surprised you. "All right," he said. The stars were fully out now. The owl had gone wherever owls go. The land lay open and dark and enormous in front of them, as it had lain for 1,000 years before they were born and would lie for 1,000 years after they were gone, patient and indifferent and completely beautiful. Neither of them went inside for another hour. A few days later, on an ordinary Wednesday morning, the mail arrived with a letter from a law office in Cheyenne. It was addressed to Cal. He picked it up from the table and looked at the return address for a long moment. Then he set it back down without opening it. Ellie was in the doorway to the kitchen. She saw him set it down. She saw the name of the sender, small and neat, in the upper corner of the envelope. Re-estate of Emmett Briggs. Cal's hand rested on the envelope for just a moment. Then he walked outside. The letter stayed on the table all day. Ellie looked at it once more that evening in passing and thought, whatever is in that envelope has been in this house a long time. It just didn't have a return address until now. She went back to the kitchen and began making supper, and outside she could hear the sound of Cal and Shep talking in the barn Low and hurried the sound of work and proximity, and she thought that whatever was coming, it was going to require all three of them. She thought they might be equal to it. She was not certain, but she thought so. And for Eleanor Voss, who had spent 9 years being certain of the wrong things, the not certainty felt like the most honest ground she had stood on in a very long time. Harlan Price came back on a Thursday. Ellie saw him from the kitchen window. First the wagon too polished for the road it was traveling, the horses too matched for working stock, the whole equipage carrying the particular quality of a man who had made money recently enough that he still felt the need to announce it. She watched him come up the road and felt something settle in her. Not fear, not quite anger, but a kind of steadying the way a ship's keel finds its depth when the water gets rough. She dried her hands on her apron and went to stand on the porch. Cal was already there. He had come from the barn when he heard the wagon, and he stood at the top of the porch steps with his arms at his sides, and the particular stillness of a man who had decided to let the other man do the talking first. Shep appeared from somewhere. He had a gift for appearing when things were about to matter, and stood slightly behind and to the left of his uncle, which was either instinct or the result of careful observation of how men position themselves. Price climbed down from the wagon with the ease of a man who expected the ground to meet him at a convenient height. He was 51, thickening through the middle in the way of men who had done hard physical work in their youth and had since found ways to have other men do it for them. His suit was dark, and his boots were clean in a way that boots were only clean if someone else cleaned them. He smiled at Cal with the smile of a man who practiced smiling as a professional skill. "Mr. Briggs." He took in Ellie with a glance that was brief and assessing and concluded quickly, "I see congratulations are in order." "Mrs. Briggs," Cal said, not elaborating. Price's eyes moved to Ellie again, slower this time. She held his gaze without effort. She had held the gaze of Theodore Voss for 9 years across dinner tables and drawing rooms and every kind of social combat that polite society had invented for the purpose of establishing dominance without appearing to. Harlan Price was a direct instrument compared to Theodore. She could read him like a broadsheet. "I've come to revisit our conversation from last month," Price said to Cal. "I think on reflection, my first offer may not have fully accounted for the property's potential." "The property's not for sale," Cal said. "Everything's for sale, Mr. Briggs. It's only a matter of finding the right number." "Then the number you're looking for doesn't exist." Price's smile did not diminish. This was a man who had heard no before. He had simply learned to regard it as a preliminary position rather than a conclusion. "I wonder if you've had the opportunity to review your loan agreement recently," he said. The words were conversational. The tone was the tone of a man placing a card on a table he already knew he held. "The one your brother signed in 1921, the updated version." Cal said nothing. The stillness of him changed quality, not the stillness of a man who was calm, but the stillness of a man who was paying a different kind of attention now. "There's a provision," Price continued, "regarding changes in marital status. Section 7, it requires any new spouse to be added to the loan documentation within 30 days of the marriage. A formality, really, except that it's not a formality when it isn't completed. When it isn't completed, the bank has the right to call the full balance immediately." The porch was quiet. A crow somewhere in the cottonwoods by the creek called twice and went silent. "I was married 2 weeks ago," Cal said. 28 days ago, Price said, "by my count." The precision of it, the specificity of the number, told Ellie everything she needed to know about how long this man had been watching them. You did not know it had been 28 days unless you had been counting from the day the marriage was recorded. 2 days. They had 2 days. She looked at Price with the expression she had learned to use with men like him, perfectly composed, perfectly attentive, giving nothing, and she looked at the papers he had produced from his coat pocket with the same attentiveness she brought to everything that mattered. He handed them to Cal. Cal looked at them. The set of his jaw told her what the paper said before he finished reading them. She held out her hand without speaking. Cal passed them to her. She read. She read carefully the way she had learned to read Theodore's correspondence, not for what it said, but for what it was built to accomplish. The loan agreement was dense with language, the kind of language designed to reward the patient reader and punish the careless one. Section 7 was on the 3rd page. It was half a paragraph in a document of many paragraphs, And it was the kind of thing a man managing a ranch during a difficult winter in the wake of his brother's death with a grieving boy to attend to might easily have missed. She handed the papers back to Price. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention," she said. Her voice was pleasant and gave him nothing. "We'll be in touch." Something shifted in Price's expression. Surprise, she thought, and then something that recalculated quickly. He had not expected her to speak. Or rather, he had expected her to speak in the way that women in that era were often expected to speak, deferentially or emotionally, or not at all. He had not expected her to speak in the tone of someone who had already finished thinking about the next three moves. He tipped his hat. He climbed back into his wagon. He drove back down the road at the same unhurried pace he had arrived, and she watched him go with the feeling of a woman who has just identified exactly what she is dealing with and finds the clarity useful if not comfortable. Cal stood beside her until the wagon disappeared. "He's been counting the days since the wedding," Cal said. "Not a question." "Since before the wedding," Ellie said. "He knew about the provision before you were married. He waited." Cal looked at her. "The agreement was drafted to create this situation," she said. "The question is whether it was drafted that way originally or whether it was changed." She was already thinking about the signatures. She had noticed reading the document a particular quality of the ink on the Section 7 paragraph, slightly different from the surrounding text, not dramatically, just enough that a person who had spent 9 years looking closely at documents would notice. Theodore had taught her that inadvertently. He had revised things, household accounts, social obligations, his own promises to her, and she had learned to read the evidence of revision in paper and ink and the small discontinuities of a document that had been altered after its original completion. She did not say this yet. She needed to be certain. "We need to go to the bank tomorrow," she said. "I want to see the original." They went to the bank in Laramie the following morning, all three of them, though Cal had suggested that Ellie and Shep might remain at the ranch. Ellie had simply gotten into the wagon. Shep had gotten in after her. Cal had picked up the reins without further comment. Price was not at the bank when they arrived, which was either coincidence or strategy. She suspected. Strategy suspected he preferred to have his clerks manage the initial encounter and save himself for the moment when a decision needed to be ratified rather than made. The clerk who received them was young and uncomfortable, in the way of young men placed in situations where their authority is uncertain. They were shown the loan documentation. The original, the clerk assured them, fully signed and notarized. Ellie read it again. This time she read it with the sole purpose of looking at Section 7, at the ink, at the consistency of the type at the notary stamp in its relationship to the surrounding text. The stamp was slightly off-register with the paragraph it authenticated. Not dramatically. Just enough. In the wagon on the way home, she told Cal what she had seen. He was quiet for a long time. The road ran flat and straight between fields of winter-pale grass, and the sky above them was the enormous open sky of Wyoming that she was still, after 3 weeks, not entirely accustomed to. "You're certain," he said. "I'm certain enough to look further," she said. "I'm not certain enough to make a claim yet." "How do you know what to look for?" She considered how to answer this. "Theodore managed a great deal of money," she said, "and he was meticulous about documentation. I watched him closely for 9 years, and I learned, without his intending to teach me, that documents tell you things their authors don't mean to tell you. The weight of the pen, where someone paused, where the ink is slightly different because the pen was dipped again." She looked at the road ahead of them. "He thought I was learning the household accounts. I was learning everything else." Cal looked at her, that look again, the one that was not his neutral assessment, but something more direct. "What else do you need?" he said. "The original purchase documentation from 1905, she said. "Your father's papers, the records that exist before Price had any access to the bank's files." "Those would be at the county office," Cal said. "Then that's where you need to go," Ellie said. "You know those records better than I do. You know what your father signed and when. If the original agreement didn't have Section 7, the county records will show it." He nodded, the kind of nod that was a decision, not just an acknowledgement. "I'll go tomorrow morning," he said, "early, before Price knows I'm in town." Shep, who had been sitting in the wagon bed with the studied inattention of a boy who was in fact paying close attention to everything, said, "I'll come." "You'll stay at the ranch," Cal said. "I know things," Shep said. "I hear things. Sometimes I know things you don't know yet." Cal looked at him over his shoulder. "Like what?" like the fact that Mr. Alderton used to work at the bank before Price owned it. Mr. Morrison told me when I went with him to the county market last month. He said Alderton was the one who kept all the old records and that Price let him go when he bought the place and that Alderton was sore about it for a long time. He met his uncle's eyes steadily. If somebody changed the papers, Alderton would know. The wagon moved through the midday light. Cal faced forward again. "Where does Alderton live?" he said. "East end of town," Shep said, "near the old church." Cal left before dawn the next morning. Ellie heard him go, heard the particular sequence of sounds that a careful man makes when he is trying not to wake a household, the slow creak of the floorboard he always avoided. Then the door, then silence. She lay in the darkness for a moment and thought about what he was going to find and what they would do with it, depending on what that was and whether the shape of this fight was one they could win. She was not afraid exactly. She had been afraid in her marriage to Theodore in a way that had no sharp edges, a chronic ambient fear, the kind that becomes invisible because it never fully stops. This was different. This was a specific threat with specific edges, and specific threats with specific edges were in her experience manageable in a way that ambient ones were not. You could fight a thing you could name. She rose at 5 and went to work. At mid-morning, when she was beating a rug on the porch rail and the day had gone clear and cold and brilliant, she heard a horse and turned to find Cal coming up the road. He was moving at a pace that was not urgency, but was not leisure, either the pace of a man who had found what he was looking for and was carrying it carefully. He came up the porch steps and handed her a folded piece of paper. It was a copy she had not expected him to produce a careful transcription he had made himself in his mechanical handwriting of the original purchase agreement from the county records. The original dated 1905, signed by Josiah Briggs and the previous bank owner, a man named Colworth, and notarized by a county clerk whose name was not Price's clerk and whose stamp was not Price's stamp. No Section 7, not a word of it. The original loan had no provision about marital status, no penalty clause, no 30-day requirement. It was a straightforward agricultural loan with terms that were in the context of 1905 entirely ordinary. Ellie read it twice. Then she folded it and held it. "Alderton," Cal said. "I went to see him after the county office." She looked up. He was at home. He didn't want to talk at first. Cal sat down on the porch step. He did not sit down often. She had learned he was a man who generally remained in motion when there was motion to be maintained. The fact that he sat meant something. "I told him about Emmett, about how my brother signed papers when I was sick, when I was trusting him to manage things, and how my brother was a man who didn't read carefully enough and was too proud to say when he was in over his head. He was looking at the road, the way he looked at things that cost him something. I told him Emmett was dead, and that I had his boy at home, and that whatever Price had done, he had started doing it to my brother before he finished doing it to me." Ellie waited. "Alderton kept the records," Cal said. "He kept his own copies when Price let him go. He said he kept them because he didn't feel right about some of what he'd seen, and a man who doesn't feel right about something and does nothing about it at least owes the world the evidence." He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. He wrote it out, all of it, signed and witnessed by his neighbor who's a notary. She took the envelope. She did not open it yet. "You told him about Emmett," she said. "Yes." That wasn't easy. No, she thought about the man who had gotten up before dawn and driven to town alone, not because she had asked him to, but because he had heard what she saw and had gone to do the part only he could do. She thought about what it had cost him to sit in William Alderton's kitchen and tell a stranger the story of his brother's failure to use the hardest thing he knew as the instrument of a necessary task. She thought this is what it looks like when a person brings everything they are to a problem instead of only the parts they're comfortable with. She opened the envelope and read what Alderton had written. That evening, after Shep was in bed, Cal received an anonymous letter. It arrived under the door. She heard it, a soft sound she almost dismissed as the wind, but when she came downstairs for water, there it was on the floor, a single sheet folded once. She brought it to Cal in the parlor. He read it. His face did not change. She could not help it. "What does it say?" He handed it to her. The handwriting was plain and unidentifiable. The message brief: "Drop this or someone you care about gets hurt. Price's patience isn't unlimited and neither is mine." She set the letter on the table. She did not feel the thing she might have expected to feel, the cold contraction of fear that a threat is designed to produce. She felt instead a clarifying anger, the kind that burned clean and steady and gave you something to work with. This was not Theodore's ambient management. This was a man frightened enough of losing to send a letter in the dark, and men who sent letters in the dark were men who had already run out of better options. He knows the documentation won't hold, she said. He sent this because he knows. Maybe, not maybe. If he were confident in the legal position, he wouldn't need this. She looked at the letter. He needs you to be afraid. It means he's afraid. Cal looked at her. We go to the hearing, she said, with everything we have. He was quiet for a moment. In the parlor, the lamp burned low and the window showed a rectangle of dark sky and cold stars. And the house was quiet around them, with the particular quiet of a building at night that is full of sleeping and waking in equal measure. There's something I almost did, he said. That night I got the letter, before I decided to go to Alderton. She waited. I almost decided to sell, he said. The numbers he's offering would set you and Shep up somewhere. Somewhere without this hanging over it. She said nothing yet. I was close to it, he said. I was sitting right here and I could see it, the clean version, the version where nobody gets threatened and nobody has to fight and I can just stop. He turned the cup in his hands. And then Shep came in the next morning and told me about Alderton, and I thought if I sell because I'm afraid I'm teaching that boy that fear is a good enough reason to let go of something true. And Emmett already taught him that. I wasn't willing to teach it twice. Ellie looked at him. You didn't tell me you were afraid, she said. Not reproach, observation. No, you could have. I know. He held her gaze, held it without flinching, which was she was learning what he did instead of looking away. I'm learning. Some things I learned to carry alone so long that I forgot they didn't have to be carried that way. She thought about 9 years in a house where showing your uncertainty was a liability. She thought about how long habits of self-protection persist after the threat that created them has passed. So do I, she said. The lamp burned. The house was quiet. Tomorrow, she said, we take what we have to Theodore Fitch in Cheyenne. Reverend Fitch can write to his brother tonight, and we can be there by noon. You've been thinking about this. Since Laramie, she said, since I saw the ink. They went to Reverend Fitch in the morning. Aldous Fitch was a man who had spent 20 years in rough country and had developed the particular theological disposition of a man whose faith had been tested by practical circumstance more than once and had each time survived in a modified but more durable form. He was spare and dry-humored, and he listened without interrupting, which was rarer than it should have been. When Cal and Ellie finished laying out what they had, he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. I've known Harlan Price for 20 years, he said. I've watched him operate. I've watched him pick up property when the owners were distracted or desperate or didn't read carefully, and I've sat here every Sunday preaching about justice to a congregation that includes men like him, and I've wondered what exactly justice was supposed to look like in practical terms. He looked down from the ceiling. I'll write to Theodore tonight. He can be here by Thursday. The hearing is Friday, Cal said. Then he'll be here by Thursday. He wrote the letter while they waited. He was a man who, when he committed to a thing, completed it without leaving it for later. As they were leaving, Fitch stopped Cal at the door. Your brother, he said, Emmett. He came to me once, maybe 2 years before he died. He didn't come to confess exactly. More to think out loud. He paused. He knew what he'd signed. He knew it wasn't right. He just couldn't figure out how to undo it without telling you what he'd done, and telling you was the thing he couldn't make himself do. Cal stood in the doorway. He was ashamed, Fitch said. Not of the mistake, of not being the man you thought he was. The morning light came flat and bright across the churchyard. A meadowlark somewhere in the near distance sang its 3-note scale and repeated it. He was that man too, Cal said. He just didn't know it. He walked to the wagon. Ellie was already in the seat looking at the meadow. She had heard. She gave him no indication of it, which was its own form of consideration. He climbed up and took the reins, and they drove home through the bright morning without speaking, and the silence between them was the kind of silence that occurs when two people have heard something true at the same time and are both letting it settle. Theodore Fitch arrived on Thursday evening. He was his brother's opposite in appearance, broad where Aldous was spare-floored, where Aldous was dry, but they shared the same quality of listening, the same disposition toward plain speaking. He reviewed the documentation in the parlor while Cal and Ellie sat across from him, and he read with the methodical patience of a man for whom thoroughness was a professional standard and also a personal temperament. He asked 4 questions. They answered them. He asked 3 more. They answered those. Then he sat back and looked at the fire in the grate. The amended Section 7 is fraudulent, he said. The original notarization doesn't authenticate the section because the section wasn't there when the notarization occurred. Alderton's testimony confirms the amendment was made after the fact. He picked up the county record Cal had transcribed. And this establishes that the original loan agreement, the one your father and Colworth actually signed, contained no such provision. Price is enforcing a clause that doesn't legally exist. He'll fight it, Cal said. He might, and if he does, he'll lose, and he'll also face a separate action for fraudulent alteration of a legal document, which is a considerably more serious matter than losing a civil case. Fitch looked at him. I suspect Price is aware of this. The question is whether he knows that you know it. He knows we're prepared, Ellie said. He sent a letter. Fitch raised an eyebrow. Cal produced the anonymous letter. Fitch read it, set it down without expression. All right, he said. Tomorrow we take all of this in front of Judge Harker and we let the record do what the record does. When Fitch had gone to his room, Ellie and Cal sat alone in the parlor for a while. The fire had burned down to coals, and neither of them moved to add wood. Outside, a wind had come up off the mountains. She could hear it working around the corners of the house, finding the places where the wood had settled and the gaps had opened, which was what wind did on a Wyoming night in spring. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Then Cal said, "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that I'm glad you came." She looked at him, not because of the hearing, not because of what you found in the documents. He was looking at the coals, because of all of it, every day. Ellie sat with that for a moment. She thought about all the ways she could respond, the careful ways, the measured ways, the ways she had learned to respond when she was not certain how much it was safe to give. So am I, she said. They went to their separate rooms and did not sleep much, and in the morning they drove to Laramie with Theodore Fitch as the light came up cold and clear across the plains, and none of them spoke about the night before because some things do not need to be elaborated upon. They simply need to have been said. The hearing was held in the county courthouse in Laramie, in a room that smelled of wood polish and old paper, and the accumulated weight of decisions that had mattered to the people who had sat in it before them. Price was there with his own lawyer, a man from Cheyenne who wore an expensive suit, and the specific confidence of someone who had won often enough in this room to have stopped preparing as thoroughly as he once had. Judge Harker was 71 years old. He had the face of a man who had heard every variety of human argument and had developed a finely calibrated sense of which ones were worth his full attention. He read the documents that Theodore Fitch presented with the same methodical patience that Fitch had brought to them the evening before. When he was done, he looked up. "Counselor," he said to Price's lawyer, "Section 7. Price's lawyer stood. He made his argument. It was well constructed, and the terms were precise, and it would have been sufficient if the documentation had been what Price had represented it to be. Then Theodore Fitch presented the county records. The original agreement, the notarization, the Alderton affidavit, the physical evidence of the ink. Price's lawyer requested a recess. Judge Harker denied it. The room was very quiet. The provision in question, Judge Harker said, was not present in the original authenticated agreement and was subsequently added without the knowledge or signature of the barring party. The amendment is fraudulent and therefore unenforceable. He set the documents down with the deliberateness of a man closing a chapter. Furthermore, I'm referring the matter of the alteration itself to the county prosecutor's office. Mr. Price, I suggest you arrange a conversation with your attorney at your earliest convenience, a different conversation than the one you came here to have." Price sat very still. Whatever he had thought would happen in this room, it was not this. The specific confidence of his lawyer had gone somewhere Ellie couldn't identify. She looked at Cal beside her. He was looking at the judge, and his face was the face he wore when he was completing a task that had required everything he had, not triumph, not relief exactly, but the particular quiet of a man who has carried a weight to its destination and set it down. She thought he'll need to sit with this later. The relief will come later, when he's alone with the land. She thought, I'm glad I'm here for the before and the after. On the road home from Laramie, Cal stopped the wagon. Not for a reason she could see, not an obstacle in the road, not a horse that needed adjustment. He simply stopped, and they sat in the open air of a Wyoming afternoon that was clear and still, and full of the particular quality of late spring light that touches everything with an almost painful precision. I almost sold, he said, as if the thought had been sitting in him all day waiting for a moment quiet enough to be spoken fully. I know, she said. I should have told you that night, when I was deciding. Not after. She looked at the road ahead. The grass on both sides ran flat to the horizon, broken only by the distant line of the mountains. You told me now, she said. It's not the same. No, she agreed, but it's not nothing either. Most people don't tell you at all. She turned to look at him. I kept things from Theodore. Not important things, or what I thought at the time weren't important things. I kept them because I had learned that showing him my uncertainty was dangerous. I kept the habit long after the danger was gone. She paused. I'm still carrying it. I didn't tell you about going to the library in Denver when I was researching property law before I even arrived. I should have said, this is what I'm doing, and this is what I'm looking for. Instead, I said nothing until I had something certain to report. He looked at her. We're both learning, she said, separately and together. That seems honest. The afternoon light moved slowly across the mountains. A hawk hung motionless above the field to their right, held in place by something invisible. Yes, Cal said. He picked up the reins. They drove the rest of the way home in silence, but it was a different silence from the ones that had come before it, not the working silence of two people managing proximity, not the careful silence of two people avoiding what they hadn't yet said. It was the silence of two people who had said a hard, true thing and were sitting with what had opened up. When they came over the last rise and the ranch came into view, the house and the barn and the fence lines running out into the enormous land, and the blue curtains in the kitchen window, visible even from this distance, a small square of color in all that wide, pale space, Cal slowed the horses. He didn't say anything, neither did she. But she thought that this was what the letters had not been able to tell her, and what she had had to come all this way to learn, that a place looked different when you had fought for it. That it looked different when you had stood beside someone who did not run when running would have been easier, and who told you the truth even when the truth made them less impressive. She was not certain yet what she was building here. She was not ready to call it by the names that were available to her, but she was certain it was real. And she was certain for the first time in a very long time that real was enough to go on. The ranch felt different after the hearing. Not easier exactly. The work was the same, the horses still needed. Tending the fences still needed walking. The accounts still needed their weekly reckoning in Cal's careful handwriting. The land did not care what had happened in a courthouse in Laramie. It required the same things from them that it had always required, with the same indifference to whether they were equal to the requirement. But something had shifted in the quality of the silence inside the house. The envelope from the Cheyenne law office still sat on the desk in the parlor. Cal had moved it once from the table to the desk, but had not opened it. Ellie did not ask about it. She had learned the difference between things that needed pressing and things that needed time, and this was a thing that needed time. Whatever Emmett had written in those 17 letters, whatever the law office held in that envelope regarding his estate, it would arrive when Cal was ready for it to arrive, and not before. She was patient. Patience was, she had discovered over the past 9 years, one of the few genuinely useful things her marriage to Theodore had given her. Not the submissive patience of a woman who had learned to wait because she had no alternative, but the operational patience of a woman who had learned that timing was a form of precision, that knowing when to act was as important as knowing how. She was still learning when to apply which kind. 3 days after the hearing, Dot came with a basket. She knocked this time. Ellie noticed it, the small, formal gesture of it, the 3 deliberate knocks, rather than the easy familiarity she suspected had preceded them in the years before Ellie's arrival. She opened the door, and Dot came in with the basket and set it on the table and began unpacking it with her customary efficiency, and for a few minutes they simply worked alongside each other in the kitchen without requiring conversation, which was its own kind of acknowledgement of how far they had come in a short time. Shep appeared in the doorway, looked at the basket, looked at Dot, and said, "Is that the apple cake?" It is, Dot said. Good. He disappeared again. Dot watched him go with a small smile that contained more than amusement, something maternal and complicated. The smile of a woman who had cared about a child for longer than the child had been old enough to register it. He's going to be all right, Ellie said. I know, Dot said. He was going to be all right before you got here too. Cal would have seen to it. She placed the last dish on the counter and folded the cloth that had covered the basket. But he's going to be better than all right now. That's the difference. They worked together through the late morning. Dot moving through the kitchen with the ease of long familiarity. Ellie with the growing confidence of someone who had stopped treating an unfamiliar space with apology and had begun treating it as hers. At some point, the work became companionable in a way that did not require either of them to name it. Near noon, Dot paused at the kitchen window. She looked at the blue curtains for a moment, not long. Just a moment, the kind of glance you give to something you have already made peace with, but whose presence still registers. I put those up in the spring of 22, she said. The kitchen was too dark in the mornings. Ellie looked at the curtains. The light came through them in the particular way of thin fabric filtered, softened, making the kitchen a warmer color than it would otherwise be. They're good curtains, she said, and they are. Dot was quiet for a moment. Then, I'm going to stop coming as often. Not stopping entirely, we're neighbors, and I'm not the woman who makes dramatic gestures, but less often. You don't need me to fill in the gaps anymore. The gaps are filling themselves. Ellie looked at her. That's not something most people would say, she said. Most people don't know how to let go of something without pretending they never wanted it. Dot picked up her basket. I'm 63 days from 42 years old. I know what I want, and I know what I'm not going to have, and I've decided those are two separate pieces of information that don't have to ruin each other. She moved toward the door. Ellie followed, and they stood for a moment in the doorway with the spring air coming in around them, cool and smelling of turned earth, and the particular sharpness of new grass. Dot looked back at the kitchen one last time, at the curtains. Leave them, she said, answering a question Ellie had not asked. They belong there. They were always going to belong to whatever this kitchen became. I just didn't know what that was yet when I put them up. She walked down the porch steps and across the yard to where she had left her horse, and she rode east toward her own land without looking back, which was, Ellie thought, a form of integrity, the refusal to undermine a clean departure with a backward glance. She stood in the doorway until Dot was out of sight. Then she went back inside and looked at the curtains for a long moment in the midday light, thinking about the women who leave things in places they cannot stay, and whether that was loss or generosity or some combination of the two that did not have a clean name. She thought it was probably all three. That evening, Cal opened the envelope. He did not announce that he was going to do it. He came in from the barn after supper, washed his hands at the basin, and went to the desk in the parlor and picked it up, and Ellie, who was mending at the table, looked up and then looked back down at her work because this was one of those moments that required presence without pressure. She heard the paper unfold. She heard nothing for a long time after that. When Cal spoke, his voice was level in the way that voices are level when a person is working hard to keep them that way. It's the documentation for Emmett's estate, he said. What he had, what he owed. A pause. There's a letter from his lawyer, the one who managed things after Emmett died. He found the 17 letters in Emmett's things. He sent them to me with the estate papers. Another pause longer. He says Emmett wrote the first one in the spring of 22, right after he signed the papers with Price's bank. Ellie set down her mending. Emmett knew, Cal said, almost immediately. He knew he'd been maneuvered into signing something he didn't understand, and he knew that when I found out I would, he writes that I would be angry. He was wrong about that. I wouldn't have been angry. He stopped. I would have been, I don't know the right word, something worse than angry, worried for him, worried about what it said about how he saw himself. Ellie waited. He writes that he couldn't tell me because he couldn't stand for me to see what he'd done, Cal said. He writes that I had always been the one who did things right, and he had always been the one who did things sideways, and that he had spent his whole life trying to figure out if there was some version of himself that could earn what he thought He stopped again. She got up from the table and came to stand near the desk, not beside him, but close within the periphery of his awareness. She did not touch him. She simply occupied the space, which was its own form of presence. He thought you thought less of him, she said. He thought I had always thought less of him. Cal's voice was still level, but the levelness was costing something now. And the truth is I never did. I was frustrated with him. I was sometimes frightened for him, but he was my brother. He was the only person in the world who remembered the same childhood I remembered. He set the letter down carefully as if it were fragile, as if it were something that needed to be treated with a care it had not received before. He spent his whole life running from a judgment I never made. The parlor was quiet. Outside, the Wyoming dark was total no moon tonight, just the vast spread of stars that Ellie still was not entirely accustomed to, that still sometimes made her stop whatever she was doing and simply look. "May I read them?" she said. "The letters, not tonight, whenever you're ready." He looked at her. His face in the lamplight showed everything it usually kept below the surface. Not grief exactly, but the particular exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something heavy for so long that he has forgotten what it felt like to put it down. "Yes," he said, "I'd like you to." She went back to the table and picked up her mending. He stayed at the desk. Neither of them spoke for a long time, and the silence was the most intimate thing that had passed between them in the 6 weeks she had been at the ranch, not because of what was said in it, but because of what was permitted in it, what was allowed to exist between them without being managed or redirected or made smaller. This, she thought, was what it meant to be in the same room with someone rather than merely in their presence, to let the difficult things breathe. The next morning, she read the letters. She sat at the kitchen table in the early light, before anyone else was awake, with a cup of coffee and the stack of envelopes arranged in chronological order, and she read them the way she read everything that mattered, carefully, without rushing, letting each one settle before moving to the next. Emmett Briggs had not been a literary man. His handwriting was loose and variable, and his sentences sometimes went somewhere other than where they had started, and he had a habit of crossing things out and writing them differently, and then sometimes crossing out the revision too. But his letters had the quality she had recognized in his brother's correspondence. They were honest in a way that had no performance in it, no arrangement for effect. The first letter explained what had happened with the loan. The second apologized. The third apologized in a different way, more specifically, more painfully. By the fifth letter, Emmett had moved past apology into something more complex, a kind of accounting, an attempt to explain himself, not in defense, but in the hope that understanding might substitute for forgiveness, or perhaps prepare the ground for it. "I know you'll say it wouldn't have mattered," he wrote in the seventh letter. "You'll say you wouldn't have held it against me. You always say that because you always mean it, because you're built the way you're built, but I'm not built the way you're built, Cal. What I am is a man who knows the difference between what is true and what he can live with, and I couldn't live with you knowing, and I couldn't live without you knowing, and I stayed stuck between those two things for so long, I forgot I was supposed to be going somewhere." She set that letter down and looked at the kitchen window, at the blue curtains, at the light coming through. She thought about Theodore, about a different kind of man who also could not reconcile what was true with what he could live with, who had resolved the tension not by honesty, but by revising the truth until it fit the life he required. She thought about how many ways there were to be diminished by the distance between who you were and who you believed you were supposed to be. She thought about herself, about the woman who had spent 9 years becoming smaller and then 9 years trying to remember her original size. About the letters she had never written, the things she had never said to Theodore, because saying them would have cost her the only life she knew how to live at the time. She read the remaining letters. The last one, dated 7 months before Emmett's death, was shorter than the others. It did not apologize. It did not explain. It said, "I've been thinking about Shep. He's 11 now. He has your way of being still when he's thinking. Did you know that? The same thing in his face. I don't know if that's blood or if he learned it from watching you when he was small, but either way, it's yours. Take care of him if I can't. I know you will. You always do. That's the thing about you, Cal. You always do." She folded the letter and replaced it carefully in its envelope. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table and the morning light coming in around her. Then she got up and started breakfast. She told Cal that evening what she had found in the letters, not the content which she thought he should arrive at in his own time, but the quality of them. That Emmett had not been a man who lied to himself. That he had known exactly what he had done and exactly what it had cost. and that the letters were evidence of a man who had spent years in a conversation he was too frightened to have out loud. He knew you, she said. He knew who you were. He just couldn't believe you'd still want to know him if you knew who he was. Cal was quiet. The last letter, she said. He talks about Shep, about taking care of him. She paused. He knew you would. He could have asked me himself, Cal said. He didn't have to leave it in a letter. He was afraid you'd say yes, and he'd have to explain why he was asking. Cal looked at her. Because asking you to take care of his son would mean telling you that he didn't think he'd be there to do it himself, she said. And telling you that would mean telling you everything else. The evening light through the parlor window was long and golden, the particular light of late spring going to summer when the days stretched so far toward evening that you sometimes forgot there had been a morning. He was wrong, Cal said, about what I would have thought of him. I know. I wish I'd told him. I know that too. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I'm going to go talk to Shep. She nodded. He went down the hall to where Shep's room was. She heard the knock. She heard the door open. She did not hear what was said. The walls were thick, and whatever passed between them was private in the way that certain things between an uncle and his nephew need to be private. She went to the kitchen and made coffee and listened to the house around her, to the sounds of it, the creak of a floorboard, the distant sound of the horses, the wind moving across the roof, and thought about what it meant to live inside a place that was finally telling the truth about itself. When Cal came back, his face was different. Not lighter exactly, more settled, as if something that had been slightly out of alignment had been adjusted back to where it belonged. He already knew, Cal said, about Emmett, more than I thought he knew. He'd found one of the unsent letters in his father's things when they were going through them after the funeral. He didn't say anything because he didn't want to. He stopped. Then, he didn't want to make it worse for me. Ellie set down the coffee. He's 13 years old, she said. I know. He's been carrying that. He has. Cal sat down at the kitchen table. He looked tired in a way that was not the tiredness of physical work, the deeper tiredness of a man who has resolved something that took too long to resolve and is feeling the full cost of the delay. I told him what was in the letters, not all of it, the parts that were about him. He looked at his hands on the table. I told him that his father knew exactly who he was and that what he knew, what Emmett knew about Shep, was good, all of it. She sat down across from him. She did not say anything because there was nothing useful to say, and she had finally, after years of feeling that silence required filling, learned to trust that some moments were complete without words. They sat in the kitchen in the early evening with the coffee going warm between them, and the house was quiet around them, with the quiet of a place where the necessary things had been said and the remaining quiet was earned. Price's lawyer sent a letter 2 weeks later. It was formal and brief and contained a settlement offer. The bank would withdraw all claims against the Briggs Ranch and would forgive the remainder of the loan balance in exchange for Cal agreeing not to pursue further legal action regarding the fraudulent amendment. Cal read it. He handed it to Ellie. She read it. She set it down. It's generous, she said. It's self-protective, he said. He's more afraid of the prosecution referral than he is of the civil case. Both things can be true. She looked at the letter. What do you want to do? He thought about it. She watched him think, watched the particular stillness of it, the quality of attention he brought to decisions that mattered. I want the land clear, he said. I want the debt gone. I want Shep to grow up on ground that doesn't have a claim against it. He paused. I don't want to spend another 2 years in courtrooms. Then accept it, she said. You think that's right? She looked at him steadily. I think justice is rarely a single transaction, and you've already done more than most men would have. Alderton has his testimony on the record. The referral to the prosecutor's office stands regardless of what you decide. Price is going to face consequences that you're not required to personally deliver. She folded the letter. And I think your father's land, being free and clear, is worth more than the satisfaction of watching Harlan Price in a courtroom. Cal took the letter back. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he signed the acceptance and sent it back by the next day's post. The summer came to Wyoming the way it always came, not gradually, but all at once, as if the land had been waiting just beyond a threshold and then crossed it overnight. The grass went from winter pale to the particular vivid green of high country in June, and the mountains in the distance lost their snow from the shoulders down while keeping their white crowns, and the days stretched so long that Ellie sometimes looked up from work and was surprised to find it still light at what her bones insisted should be evening. She had been on the ranch for 3 months. She knew where everything was now, not just the physical objects, but the rhythms, the patterns, the way the work divided itself across the week and the season. She knew that Cal checked the north fence every Thursday, regardless of whether he had reason to suspect it needed checking. She knew that Shep was sharper in the mornings than the afternoons, and that his best questions came during or just after physical work, as if the movement loosened something in him. She knew that the bay mare had a preference for being approached from the left and would accept almost anything from that angle that she would resist from the right. She knew that Cal Briggs was a man who expressed what he felt through what he did, that he had no language for tenderness that was not also a language for work, and that understanding this required you to pay attention to the work. He had fixed the window latch in her room without being asked. He had replaced the chair at her end of the kitchen table with a slightly taller one because he had noticed her adjusting her posture at meals. He had one morning set a cup of coffee on the porch railing exactly where she stood to look at the mountains in the early light, 30 minutes before she came outside, and said nothing about it when she picked it up. These were not gestures she was accustomed to. Theodore's gestures had been large and visible and calibrated for an audience gifts that arrived when others could see them, being given courtesies extended in public and withdrawn in private. What Cal did was private in the sense of being entirely between them, witnessed only by the morning or the kitchen or the particular acre of Wyoming land where it occurred. She did not know yet what name to put on what she felt about this. She was wary of her own conclusions in matters of the heart, wary with good reason, and she did not want to mistake gratitude for love or comfort for certainty. But she had decided not going to be so cautious that she missed the thing that was actually in front of her. In late July, on an evening when the heat had finally broken, and the air had the particular freshness of a summer night after rain, she found Cal in the barn after supper. He was working on a saddle, a repair that was not urgent, but that he had been meaning to get to for weeks, the kind of task that revealed in the doing of it that the person had decided to stop putting it off. She leaned against the doorway and watched him work for a moment before he acknowledged her presence. "Shep's reading," she said. "He asked me what inalienable meant." "What did you tell him?" "I told him to look it up and then tell me what he thought it meant." She paused. He came back 20 minutes later with a 3-sentence explanation that was mostly correct. The corner of Cal's mouth moved. "He's going to need schooling beyond what we can give him here," she said. "Proper schooling. He has a real mind." "I know." Cal didn't look up from the saddle. "I've been thinking about that. There's a good school in Laramie. Boarding if necessary, though I'd rather he wasn't boarding at 13. She had looked into this without telling him because she had found she was still, despite herself, despite the conversation on the road home from the courthouse, inclined to complete her thinking before she shared it. She was working on this. If I drove him in 3 days a week through the fall, it would keep us from having to board him. Cal set down the awl and looked at her. "That's 3 days a week of driving," he said. "Both ways. I'm aware of the mathematics. You'd be willing." It wasn't quite a question. It was the kind of statement a person makes when they are testing whether something they have started to believe is actually true. "Yes," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at the saddle. "I'll look into the school," he said. "I already have the information," she said. "When you want it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said without looking up, "3 months ago, I didn't know your name." "No, I wrote you a letter telling you I couldn't promise you happiness." "You did." "I want to revisit that," he said. He set down the saddle leather and turned to face her fully, the full deliberate attention he brought to things that required it. "I don't know how to promise happiness. I don't think anyone does, honestly. But I can tell you that when I think about the next 20 years, you're in all of them. Every version, every season." He paused. "That's not a promise about how I'll feel. It's a statement about what I intend. I thought you should know the difference." Ellie looked at him, standing in the lamplight of the barn with the saddle on the rail beside him, and the horses breathing softly in their stalls, and the Wyoming night coming in dark and full of stars around the open door. She thought about the woman on the train from Denver to Laramie, reading a plain letter for the 7th time, trying to understand why it troubled her. She thought about the platform and the 15 minutes and the coffee set out in the morning light. She thought about Alderton's kitchen and the county records and the courthouse in Laramie and the road home. She thought about how she had come here looking for something she could not yet name, and had found it by doing the work of living alongside another person with honesty and consistency and the willingness to stay when staying was difficult. I know the difference, she said. She pushed off the doorway and walked across the barn to where he stood, and she stopped close enough that the distance between them was a decision rather than a circumstance. I'm not easy, she said. I have opinions about most things, and I'm usually right about them, and I've spent 9 years relearning how to say so, and I'm still learning. I won't be managed. I won't make myself smaller to fit somewhere I'm not fitting. She held his gaze. Those things are not going to change. I'm not asking them to. I know, that's why I'm telling you. He reached up and touched her face, his rough, calloused hand careful against her cheek, in the way he was careful with things that mattered, in the way he had been careful with Emmett's letters, and with Shep's grief, and with the saddle on the rail beside him. Ellie, he said, just her name, but he said it the way a man says a thing he has earned the right to say without performance, without apology, with the plain weight of someone who means it. She put her hand over his. All right, she said. They were married in the true sense of the word. She thought not on the day Reverend Fitch had said the words over them. Those words had been true and necessary, but they had been the beginning, the structure without the substance. They were married in the true sense sometime between the hearing in Laramie and the barn in late July, in the accumulation of mornings and honest conversations and things left on porch railings and letters read in early light, and decisions made together without either of them being diminished by the making. Marriage, she had decided, was not a state you arrived at. It was a practice. You did it every day imperfectly, and the imperfection was part of it, and the willingness to keep doing it despite the imperfection was the thing that gave it its worth. In August, Shep began at the school in Laramie. He was skeptical on the first morning. She could see it in the set of his shoulders as she drove the wagon into town, the watchful containment of a boy who had learned not to want things too loudly until he was certain they were real. On the third day, he came out of the school building at the end of the afternoon, carrying 3 books that were not his own and talking before he reached the wagon. The teacher has a theory about the railroad and the homesteaders, he said, climbing up beside her. I think she's wrong about part of it. I told her so. What did she say? She said I was possibly right and that I should write out my argument and bring it Thursday. Ellie picked up the reins. Are you going to? I've already started it in my head, he said. I need to find some of the records from the county office to make the case properly. She looked at him, at this boy who had his uncle's stillness and his father's restlessness in something of his own that was purely himself, something she did not yet have a name for, but recognized as the shape of a particular kind of future. I know someone at the county office, she said. He looked at her. Then he grinned, sudden and unguarded, the grin of a boy who had not yet learned to be careful with his own delight, who had decided somewhere in the past 4 months that certain people were worth the risk of being unguarded around. It was, she thought, the best thing she had seen in a long time. The summer went to fall the way Wyoming summers went, quickly, without apology, the light changing almost overnight from the long gold of August to the shorter, sharper light of September, the mountains putting their snow back on the grass, going from green to amber, to the particular winter pale that she recognized now as the color the land wore when it was settling in for the long work of endurance. She had been on the ranch for 6 months. She knew this place now. Not completely. She did not think you ever knew a place completely, that places like people kept revealing themselves in layers, that the knowing was a process rather than a destination. But she knew it in the way you know something you have worked alongside that has required things of you and received them and given things in return. She stood at the kitchen window on a morning in early October when the first real cold had come down from the mountains overnight, and the grass was stiff with frost in the early light. Cal was already in the barn. She could see the barn door open, could see the warm yellow of the lamp inside. Shep was still asleep. She could hear the particular silence of an upstairs room with someone sleeping in it, the quality of quiet that was different from the quality of an empty room. She had a letter to write. She had been putting it off, not from reluctance, icky, but from the feeling that it required more care than she had been able to give it. It was to a woman she had known in Boston, a friend from before Theodore, who had written twice since Ellie's departure, asking how the West had received her and whether she was all right. She sat down at the kitchen table with the coffee and the paper in the early light coming through the blue curtains, and she wrote, "I am more than all right," she wrote. "I am something I don't have an adequate word for yet. I am a woman who came a long way to find out what she was made of, and discovered in the finding that she was made of more than she knew. The winters here are not mild as I was warned. The work is real, and sometimes the work is everything. There is a man who doesn't waste words, and a boy who uses them precisely, and a kitchen window with blue curtains that someone else hung and left behind, and all of it, the work and the man and the boy and the curtains, feels like it was always going to be mine. I just had to go a long way to get here. I am for the first time in longer than I can accurately calculate entirely where I mean to be." She stopped writing and looked at the last sentence for a moment. Then she folded the letter and set it aside to finish later and got up to start breakfast. Because the morning was doing what mornings did and the barn door was open and there was work to be done, and she was, as she had written, entirely where she meant to be. The coffee was hot. The light was coming. Outside, the frost lay silver across the whole enormous land, and in the barn the lamp was burning, and presently she would hear boots on the porch and then the door, and the day would begin in earnest the way days did when they were actually yours. She was ready for it. She had been, she thought, ready for a long time. She had just needed somewhere worthy of the readiness.